Part 1. Walter and the New Pair of Socks. Early morning. The sky was a dull gray, like an old cloth left out too long in the cold wind. In a small wooden house, tucked away at the end of a quiet street, the only light came from a foggy kitchen window. Inside, Walter stood, slightly hunched, thinning silver hair, a face lined with time that no one noticed anymore, because no one had looked at him long enough in quite a while. He sat on the edge of the bed. His bare feet touched the freezing wooden floor. In his hands, he held a new pair of wool socks, still carrying the scent of cheap yarn and a hint of perfumed powder from the discount store on the corner. Pale green, a bit off from his usual taste. But that day, Walter had picked them up and bought them without much thought. He put the socks on slowly, as if performing a ritual. One side was a bit crooked. He adjusted it. His fingers were no longer nimble. A loose thread peeked out at the heel of the right sock. He looked at it, considered it, then smiled faintly, a smile that could have been satisfaction, or maybe quiet acceptance. On the wooden chair in the corner of the room, he had already hung up a white shirt. The collar had yellowed slightly, but it was crisply ironed. The bottom button was a bit loose. He slipped his arms into the shirt and tried it on in front of the mirror. The hem puffed a little. The fabric caught at his waist, where he used to be slimmer. He pulled the collar closed, but didn't fasten the button. Just stood there, looking at himself. The mirror reflected a man who had lived nearly a whole life. And in that moment, it was as if he were asking himself whether he was still presentable enough to sit at a family table, even at the far end, even if no one offered him a second helping of meat. By the dining table sat a bottle of wine. Walter had wiped the dust off the label the night before. He'd bought the bottle in June. One sunny day he saw it on sale, picked it up, brought it home, and placed it on the shelf with a handwritten note, "To be saved." No one knew for whom it was saved, but he knew. He intended to bring it along on Christmas Eve to his son's house. He placed the wine bottle into a brown paper bag, no ribbon. Carefully, he wrapped a piece of soft cloth around the neck of the bottle to prevent it from knocking around. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, from thoughts. From a nearby drawer, he took out an old plastic comb, the kind his wife used to brush his hair with every time they got ready to attend church on the night of the 24th. He combed his hair, checked the mirror again. A few white strands stuck up stubbornly. He pressed them down with his palm. It didn't work, but he let it be. The room was silent save for the slow ticking of the clock. Outside, the cold wind rustled through the withered trees, carrying a sound like the chorus of an old, sorrowful song. Walter sat down and made himself a cup of black tea, the kind he had used since his wife passed. No sugar, no milk, just hot water and bitterness, like the mornings he quietly got through without anyone checking in. He didn't drink it right away. He set the cup down, opened a drawer, and took out an old leather-bound notebook with worn corners. On the first page was a woman's delicate handwriting, "To Walter, our first Christmas together, 1978. His wife's handwriting. The year he still worked at the repair shop, still had thick hair, still smiled often when coming home reeking of motor oil. He didn't turn the page, closed it, carefully placed it back in the drawer. At the window, the first light of day faded behind thick clouds. On the table, the paper bag with the wine bottle still sat neatly. On the chair, the new socks had done their job of keeping his feet warm, though no one saw them to compliment their color or ask where he got them. Walter stood up, gently pulled out a chair, sat down, placed his hands on the table, didn't move for several minutes, as if waiting for a signal from the past, from someone long gone, or from within himself, that this year he still had a reason to show up. The house remained still. No phone ringing, no messages, no invitations. But the way he sat upright, adjusted his sleeves, glanced at the wine bag, was the way a lonely man held on to a small belief. Just enough to push back against the cold outside. Part 2. Butter Cookies and the Small Radio. The morning wind crept along the window frame like a stray cat. It hissed through tiny gaps where the rubber seals had long since dried, cracked, and gone unreplaced. Walter's kitchen remained unchanged from 10 years ago, an old gas stove clicking as it tried to ignite, the exhaust hood broken since last winter still unrepaired, and a vintage refrigerator humming with a faint vibration like the heartbeat of the house. Walter slowly tied his apron. The cream-colored canvas was yellowed, torn at one corner, but still dusted with traces of flour from past baking sessions. On the counter, he had already laid out the ingredients: flour, sugar, eggs, unsalted butter. The exact brand his wife used to favor had to be the kind with a clean taste. Never sharp, the kind only seasoned bakers could distinguish by flavor. He didn't need a written recipe. Every step was stored quietly in memory, like how his hand instinctively reached behind his shoulder when looking for a coat, or how his feet knew the way home without being told. He measured flour by eye, cracked eggs one-handed, beat the mixture with a fork slow, steady, meticulous. On the dining table sat a blackened aluminum baking tray, a tiny lemon zest grater, and a slightly warped wooden rolling pin. Walter sprinkled flour over the wooden table, rolled out the dough, and cut it into small rectangular shapes. Not circles, not stars, no elaborate designs, just simple butter sticks, straight and plain, like his life. He turned on the small radio on the kitchen ledge. The sound skipped through static before settling on an old Christmas tune, "I'll Be Home for Christmas." A deep male voice poured out, blurred by the sound of the stovetop ticking and the wind brushing past the window panes. Walter didn't sing along, but his hands beat the dough more evenly. He didn't look at the radio, but he listened. The music filled a space words couldn't reach. It didn't cure the loneliness, but somehow made it more bearable. The scent of melting butter began to spread. That smell brought back so many winters, the ones when his wife was still alive and used to secretly add a drop of vanilla to the batter. The winters when his son was small and snuck cookies while they were still hot, burning his tongue and lying about it. Walter remembered that scene, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was one of the last things they ever did together in peace. He carefully arranged the cookies on the tray. His hands still trembled slightly, but he didn't drop anything. He slid the tray into the oven, turned the timer to 35 minutes. A soft tick echoed like the ticking of a clock, waking a forgotten memory. While waiting, Walter wiped the table, slowly, repeatedly, though the table wasn't dirty, maybe just to have something to do. He looked out the window. There was still no snow outside. The bare branches swayed gently, like someone waving from very far away, so far that you couldn't tell if it was a greeting or a farewell. The radio kept playing. Another song came on. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. This time he paused, listened more closely. His eyelids fluttered, not because of dust, not because he was overwhelmed, just because something unnamed had brushed quietly across his heart. He turned back inside and opened a cabinet, took out 2 porcelain plates. From the wedding set they once owned, only 4 remained without chipped edges. He placed one plate on the table, next to his now cold cup of tea. The other he picked up, and after a moment's hesitation, put back, as if unsure whether anyone would need it. The oven bell rang. He opened the door, took out the cookies. The heat rose to his face, sweet and warm, but not overpowering. The scent of old memories, the scent of things no longer spoken. Walter placed one cookie on the plate. He didn't eat it right away, just sat down. His hand rested near the plate, close but not touching. He looked at it as if waiting for someone else to walk into the room, but no one did. There was only the music, the scent of cookies, and the sound of the wind. Part 3. The car door and the words that needed no explanation. The afternoon of December 23rd arrived wrapped in a thin layer of mist that spread evenly across the windshield, as if the sky itself were trying to swallow its own light. There was no snow, no sun, only a cold gray hue covering the entire suburban neighborhood, where the trees stood bare and rooftops lined up like unopened boxes. Walter parked in front of his son's house at 3:30 p.m. He sat in the car, hands resting on the steering wheel, but not driving. The engine was off. Outside, the silence was so deep that he could hear the faint hum of the power lines and the wind passing over the eaves, like someone whispering his name from afar. The brown paper bag containing the wine bottle sat neatly in the passenger seat, tilted slightly toward him, as if reminding him, it's time. He looked up at the window of his son's house. The living room lights were on. A Christmas tree sparkled with golden light from within. A shadow passed by, female, in form. Jenna, most likely, hair tied back, wearing a white-gray wool coat familiar, like in the holiday photo card they sent last year. Walter didn't get out. He reached for his phone and pulled up the name Mark. His heart didn't race. Nothing inside him rushed anymore. He just needed a confirmation that he could step out, knock on the door, and wrap his arms around his son, like fathers do in old movies. The phone rang. Once, then twice, then a third time. On the fourth ring, Mark's voice came on quieter than Walter remembered, low, but carrying a thin film of weariness. "Dad?" Just 2 words, but they sounded like the overture to a song Walter didn't want to hear. The next moment was silence. Walter didn't interrupt. He had learned long ago that some words take time to come out, not because they're hard to say, but because they're so clear. They hurt. This year's probably not a good time. A distant voice spoke from the background, Jenna. Unclear, like a breeze brushing past the phone. But it was enough to tell Walter she was close by, part of this decision. "Jenna's got company over," Mark continued, his voice faltering. "You don't need to stop by." Nothing followed. No further explanation. No, "We're really sorry," or "maybe next year." No, "Take care of yourself." Nothing to soften the blow. The sentence stood there, bare like a door that had closed but wasn't locked, and because of that, no one dared to try it again. Walter didn't respond. He hung up. Didn't close the phone right away. Just set it down in the console tray beside the gear shift. Outside, the yellow glow from Mark's house seemed brighter through Walter's eyes. Bright enough to see clearly inside, but not enough to feel like he belonged in that light. He stayed seated a little longer, hands unmoving on the steering wheel. The wind brushed gently against the window. A thin fog began to form across the windshield, like a curtain slowly descending between him and the house. Nothing happened. No one came to the door. No child ran down the stairs, like in those sentimental Christmas commercials. Only the lights and the absence of what he had hoped for most. Walter reached for the ignition. The car didn't roar. It gave a quiet hum, like an old man lifting himself after a fall in the garden. He gently shifted gears, backed out slowly. With each meter he reversed, he felt himself growing smaller, like a fading dot of light in a colorless sky. The wine bottle in the passenger seat remained upright, undisturbed, carefully balanced like his heart, which, though rejected, still tried to preserve a kindness no one would receive. In the rear-view mirror, Walter looked back at the house. The Christmas tree in the living room still shone. The lights didn't blink, just stood there, meticulously decorated, awaiting different guests. He turned forward, merging into the empty street. No one saw him leave, and perhaps that was what saddened him the most. Part 4. Reversing the car and one's shadow in the wind. The narrow road leading out of the neighborhood was a strip of gray asphalt, empty of people. The streetlights had just come on. Their aged yellow glow stretched across the mist-dampened pavement, trailing behind distorted shadows like memories stretched too thin. Walter drove slowly. There was no reason to rush, and no one left waiting. Inside the car, the dashboard lights cast a gentle hue across the left side of his face, skin wrinkled and darkened from years working outdoors at the shop. The steering wheel beneath his hands was still familiar, but the car itself felt different today, not because it was broken, but because never before had it carried him home with such emptiness. The brown paper bag holding the wine bottle still sat on the passenger seat. One corner of the bag was crumpled, pressed slightly from his grip when he'd driven off. The hand-written label to be saved in black ink was still legible. Letters shaky and uneven, but clear. The car turned down a corner, gliding slowly past a small park where he used to take Mark every Saturday afternoon. The wooden bench under the oak tree was still there. He glanced at it through the rearview mirror. The bare trees now looked like a row of elderly men, standing in silence, waiting for the wind. Then his car moved on, leaving behind an image no one would remember. Near the bend to his house, Walter switched off the headlights, letting the car settle into the dim light of dusk. Up ahead was the small wooden home, gray shingled roof, peeling paint on the porch. A house with no Christmas lights, no wreath, no welcome sign. He parked the car, pulled the handbrake, then stayed seated, didn't get out. His head leaned gently back against the seat. His eyes didn't close, just watched the front porch, where the steps had darkened from old snow and rain. Outside, the wind picked up. Dry shrubs along the fence quivered. Tree branches stirred with a soft rustling, like the sigh of someone who's been up too late and can no longer sleep. Walter opened the car door. The wind swept in, cold and sharp, as if the old house itself had taken a deep breath to welcome him home. He stepped out, hand gripping the wine bag. Beneath his feet, the pavement reflected the car's headlight glow. He stood there, his shadow stretching long across the ground, shivering slightly with every gust of wind. The shadow wasn't big, wasn't small, but it was alone. Alone in the kind of way that doesn't need to be seen to exist. His hand gently squeezed the paper bag's handle. There was no crinkle from the bag, only the sound of his footsteps on the wooden porch, each plank groaning its own familiar note, like winter's past. At the porch, he paused, opened the door, but didn't go in right away. He turned his head back, looked down the road behind him, the road he'd just come from, the one where no one called him back. The cold wind lifted the edge of his shirt. A glimpse of pale green wool socks peeked out from under his cuffed pants. Clean, new, and unseen. Walter bowed his head slightly, as if to greet someone no longer there, then stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a small click echoing clearly into the night. His shadow lingered a moment longer on the porch before the wind blew it away. Part 5. The Ledger and the Blue Pen. The house sank into silence after the door clicked shut. No one waited inside, but Walter still held the doorknob for a few seconds, as if to confirm he was truly home, and that no one had followed behind by mistake. He didn't turn on the living room light, only the soft glow from the kitchen, dim and warm, but enough to see the way. On the wall, the old clock ticked steadily, the second hand moving like the sound of footsteps on wooden floors, slow, weary, but never stopping. Walter hung his coat neatly on the hook and took off his shoes. He walked in his socks down the hallway, the cool wooden floor pressing through the thin wool, slowing his steps. But he didn't stop. He entered his study, a small room, just large enough for a wooden desk, a chair with armrests, and a short bookshelf. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a small black notebook. The leather cover was worn, its corners frayed and slightly peeling, but the spine remained firm. He placed it on the desk. No one used this notebook but him. No computer, no Excel file, just columns of handwriting, neat and steady, in faint blue ink. Every page followed the same format: month, amount, short description, check mark on the right, January, $1,900, mortgage, Mark and Jenna, February, $1,900, mortgage, Mark and Jenna, March, April. And so it went, steadily, for 5 years. Not a single month was missing. The last entry stopped at December, still blank. Walter reached into the pen holder and pulled out a blue ballpoint pen, not a new one. This pen had once belonged to his wife. Faint lettering from the old bank where she had opened her first savings account was still visible on the side. The ink inside was uneven, but Walter kept it, not out of thrift, but because it was one of the few things left in the house that still held a trace of her presence. He removed the cap. His hand trembled slightly, but held steady. Before writing, he stared at the last entry, November, already ticked. For a long while he did nothing, just sat there, head bowed over the page, pen in hand, as if asking permission from something invisible. Then, very softly, he wrote, December, canceled. No amount, no tick, no explanation, just one word, canceled. The handwriting leaned slightly, the ink bleeding a little at the tail of the last letter. He didn't fix it. There was no need for perfection. Walter leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, like loosening a rope that had been tied around his chest for far too long. No one knew how much he'd sent. No one had ever asked. And no one knew that after every transfer he wrote it by hand in this ledger as if marking something he wanted to remember, even if no one else ever would. On the desk, the blue pen lay across the open notebook like an underline to a chapter just closed. Walter stood up, didn't tidy up, didn't put the ledger away. The light in the room remained on, but he had already turned back toward the hallway. Passing the kitchen doorway, he paused for a moment. In the stillness he heard something faint. It might have been the wind, or the sound of a bird's footstep across the roof, or perhaps the sound of a habit breaking, one that never had a name. In the soft yellow glow, the black notebook rested on the wooden desk, open, unread. The final page showing one slanted word, canceled. Like a last whisper, never meant to be sent to anyone, only left behind for himself to hear. Part 6. The cold fireplace and the picture of his late wife. The living room remained dark, lit only by the soft blur of light spilling in from the kitchen behind. Walter stepped in, not turning on the light. He knew the space so well, he didn't need to see. His hand found the switch without looking. His feet avoided the corner of the table, and he stepped carefully past the edge of the rug he knew would catch if he moved too fast. The wind slipped in through a small gap by the window, a thin draft like a stranger's sigh accidentally wandering into someone else's home. It swept across the carpet, through the curtains, brushing his back as if to remind him no one had warmed this house each night for a long time. Walter stood still before the fireplace. He didn't light it right away, just looked. The face of the fireplace was dull red brick, and above it, a small wooden mantel held only three things: a wax candle never lit, a faded silver photo frame, and a yellowed Christmas card from 1993. He picked up the photo frame. In the picture, a woman wore a blue wool hat, smiling slightly toward him, still young, still a little shy, like someone just beginning to get used to standing beside an awkward husband. Her hand rested on his shoulder, gently, like someone who always knew exactly where to stop so the other wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Walter sat down on the armchair, facing the fireplace, photo still in hand. No other footsteps echoed in the house. No clinking of spoons against mugs. No soft laughter drifting from the bedroom like there used to be. Just him and the woman who had passed away 8 years ago, sitting together in a silence so thick it felt like they were both slowly dissolving into it. He placed the photo back on the mantel, tilted it slightly toward himself, a long-standing habit, as if she were still there and needed to see him clearly. His hand reached toward the fireplace switch. A faint click sounded, but no fire. Only the electric fan inside whirred for a moment, stiffly, then stopped. A single red light blinked, then went out, like a quiet, cold refusal from something that once brought warmth. Walter didn't try again. He simply nodded slightly, as if accepting something obvious, that some things, though still within reach, no longer belonged to the living. He sank back into the chair, didn't turn on the light, didn't reach for the remote. The room stayed dim-lit only by the kitchen spill of soft yellow, just enough to see the outline of the furniture, not enough to make out a face. He looked toward the empty seat across from him. Once, the woman he loved sat there reading, legs curled under a cushion, sometimes smiling at stories no one asked her to explain. Now, there was only a wrinkled cloth and an old lumbar pillow. Walter placed his hand over his chest, as if tracing an invisible string, the kind he always thought he had learned to untie every Christmas, but in truth had only buried deeper. The wind outside kept blowing. The curtain stirred lightly. The kitchen clock struck twice 8 p.m. He didn't rise, didn't think much of anything, just sat, as if waiting for a voice to surface from within, not to explain anything, not to change anything, but simply to know that he could still hear it. Part 7. Max and the Folded Paper Tree. The next morning arrived with unexpected clarity. The sky was pale blue, cold and clean, like a blank page no one had written on yet. Early light slanted across the roof's edge, cutting through the fog on the porch, where tiny droplets clung to the wooden railing like shards of crystal, beautiful but fleeting. Walter woke up early, not because he couldn't sleep, nor because anything urgent awaited, simply out of habit. He had always risen while the house was still quiet, from the days he was a mechanic, and later, when there was no longer anyone next to him to keep him wrapped in the blanket a few minutes longer. He didn't make tea as usual, just stood by the kitchen counter, holding an old ceramic mug, sipping plain water. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of wood underfoot, the whisper of wind brushing the curtains like a polite visitor passing by, then slipping away. Then came a knock at the door, not hurried, not secretive. Just 3 small, spaced-out knocks, tap, 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 like someone who knew they weren't intruding, but still wanted to be polite. Walter opened the door. On the porch stood Max, the boy from the house next door on the left, about 7 years old, thin with messy curls, always wearing a green puffy jacket, one size too big. His left hand held a half-eaten piece of bread, bitten unevenly in two. His right hand was tucked into his pocket. He didn't say good morning, didn't explain why he was there so early. He just looked up, bright-eyed, unguarded. "Are you fixing cars today?" Max asked, not really expecting an answer, as if it were the most natural thing. To a child, the world still worked in simple logic. If it's morning, if Mr. Walter is home, if it's not raining, then surely the garage will rumble, the engine will roar, the air will smell like grease and faintly burnt wires. Walter looked at him without speaking, still standing at the doorway, neither stepping out nor inviting in. Max took another bite of bread. Then, as if remembering something, he rummaged through his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled, colorful object. He held it out without explanation. Walter leaned down and took it. It was a tiny Christmas tree, folded from pastel green cardstock, dotted with yellow marker, and topped with a red star sticker. The paper edges curled slightly, a staple bent awkwardly at one corner, but it was clearly made by 2 small hands and with very real care. "I don't have a present for you," Max said, voice even, without excuse, "but my mom taught me to fold this. It's for people who don't have a Christmas tree." Walter didn't respond immediately. He looked at the paper tree, small, light, no heavier than a wrapped candy, but his hand froze as he held it. It felt like something delicate, not because of the material, but because the meaning was so thin, so tender. It might disappear if gripped too tightly. He looked up at Max. The boy stood there, hands empty, eyes on Walter, as if trying to see whether he knew how to take care of something not everyone would dare to give. Wind brushed past Walter's shoulder. A dry leaf skidded across the porch and stopped at the watering can's foot. The sun climbed a little higher, casting light across Walter's hand, the one holding the smallest Christmas tree he had ever received. No one said anything else. Max gave a small nod, like someone who had completed a task worth doing, then turned and walked home, still finishing the last bite of bread. Slowly, unhurried, but certain. Walter watched until the door next door closed, then looked back down at the paper tree in his hand. No one saw him do it, but he gently touched the edge of the paper, adjusting the slightly crooked star, and placed it on the kitchen windowsill. There, in the slanted morning light, it stood upright, small, quiet, like the first sign that Christmas could still take root from someone who seemed like they didn't matter. Part 8. The first cake, not shared. The scent of baked butter still lingered in the kitchen, a gentle sweetness that time could never wear out. It wasn't as rich as vanilla, nor as bold as cinnamon, just enough to soften the heart, like stepping into an old house and realizing something familiar had been lost long ago. Walter opened the oven door. A wave of warm air fogged his glasses. Inside, golden butter cookies lined the tray, each rectangular piece slightly curled at the edges, unburnt. A perfect batch. He used an old oven mitt to lift the tray and set it on the counter. He exhaled softly, not from exhaustion, but out of habit. A quiet breath reserved for someone no longer there, every time he completed something. On the dining table, he had already set out a porcelain plate, one from the set reserved for special occasions, not because it was expensive, but because it was used when someone else was there to share the meal. But today, he took out only one. He picked the first cookie from the center, baked just right, not too hard, not too soft, placed it on the plate. No powdered sugar, no garnish, no arrangement. He sat down at his usual seat by the window, where slanted light traced the edge of a wooden table worn smooth by time. The cookie sat there in the silence. Walter looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up a knife and cut it in half, not to share, just out of habit. Every time before, he had cut his cookies to divide with his wife, his son, visiting neighbors, to offer a piece, to hear someone say, "This is so good." But today, there was no one. The other half remained untouched, and no hand reached toward him. He set the fork down, didn't eat right away, just leaned his elbows on the table, fingers interlaced, and looked out the window. The paper tree Max had given him still stood on the sill, tilted slightly in the breeze, as if bowing to someone Walter couldn't see. He reached over and turned on the small radio by the counter. The sound came out weak, an old male announcer giving the weather forecast. December 24th, clear skies, low temperatures, chance of light snow tonight. He didn't really listen. His ears heard it, but his eyes stayed on the cookie, the untouched half. He picked up the fork again, lifted a small piece to his mouth, chewed slowly, unrushed. The buttery taste melted gently, soft and mild. Not much different from the years before. But today, it went straight to his chest, not through his throat, not into his stomach, just stayed there, like a call no one answered. That cookie, for the first time in his life, he made without intending to share it. And maybe, for the first time, he realized there is a kind of emptiness that only arrives when kindness still lives in your heart. but there's no one left to give it to. In the pale morning light, the butter cookie sat quietly on the plate. Next to a cup of tea gone cold, Walter took another bite, no longer thinking. The piece was round, easy to swallow, not too sweet, not bitter, just enough. Like him, just enough. Somewhere out there, people were stringing up lights, wrapping gifts, practicing their greetings and tidying the living room for guests. But here, Walter had just finished his breakfast with the first cookie he'd ever made, not meant for anyone else. Part 9. The Call from the Bank. The afternoon passed quietly, like a blank sheet of paper left untouched. There was no doorbell, no children playing outside, and no parked cars along the curb like usual. The wind had weakened, and by 3:30 p.m., the sunlight was just strong enough to soften the edges of things, blurring them like a photo seen through a dusty pane of glass. Walter sat in the living room beside the little paper tree that still stood patiently on the windowsill. The room was still as a winter lake. Next to him, the small notebook lay open, its final entry, December, canceled, as if waiting for one last act to close a loop that had stretched across years. The landline rang. Its chime came suddenly, but not urgently. Each ring was short, and even like the caller, too, wasn't in a rush, merely doing what needed to be done. Walter didn't rise right away. He let it ring 3 times, then leaned over and picked up the receiver without checking the screen. A woman's voice came on the line, polite, measured, and unfamiliar. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walter. I'm calling from Maple Grove Bank to confirm the cancellation request for your automatic transfer to the account under the name Mark T. Dawson. Is that correct, sir?" Walter answered softly, "Yes, that's right." His tone was even, neither sharp nor tired, like someone who had thought it over long enough that there was no emotion left to stall him. The woman repeated the information. Start date of the cancellation, monthly amount, total number of transfers to date. Monthly, $1,900. From May, 5 years ago to now. We see a total of 60 payments. She paused briefly, then asked, "Would you like to provide a reason for canceling the transfers, sir? It might help us better support you in the future." Walter was silent for a moment. On the other end, the line grew faint, just the soft sounds of paper shifting and gentle keystrokes. Then he spoke. "No need. I just want to stop." It was a short sentence, but the last word lingered, like someone dropping something into a lake, not to make a splash, just to let it go. "Understood, sir," the woman replied, her voice steady. "We've logged the request. The transfer will end with the next cycle. No other transactions on your account will be affected. Is there anything else we can help with today?" Walter sat still. He looked out the window, where the late light was turning from gold to gray. The paper tree's shadow had shortened, leaning sideways onto the smooth wooden table, an uneven triangle. He thought of all the past transfers. No confirmation calls, no words of thanks. No one ever mentioned them. "No," he said, "that's all. Thank you for banking with us. Wishing you a peaceful day." "You too," He set the receiver down slowly. His fingertips lingered on the phone for a few seconds longer, as if the words just spoken were still warm, not yet cooled in his palm. The room returned to silence. Walter stood up. It wasn't exactly relief, not regret either. It felt like rising from a chair after sitting too long, a bit stiff at first, but eventually the body returned to its natural form, a posture that no longer needed to bow. In the kitchen, the kettle he had turned on earlier was still full. He poured it out and refilled it with fresh water. For the first time in months, he reached for the more expensive tea, the kind he had been saving, just one sachet. But he opened the packet carefully, poured the water slowly so it wouldn't spill. He sat back down and watched the steam rise. The scent was soft, not overpowering. A scent for a day that wasn't special, but a little different, because for the first time in many years, no more money would leave him without a proper goodbye. Part 10. The Gift in a Paper Bag. On the evening of December 24th, the weather began to turn colder. No snow fell, despite the forecast, only a biting wind that slithered across rooftops, sneaking through the warped wood slats of old porches, leaving behind a faint hiss like a gentle warning. This winter would be long. In the kitchen, Walter sat alone at the table. The butter cookies had gone cold, resting beside a half-empty cup of tea. He no longer touched them, just sat there, staring at a small object before him, a cheap Lego box, still wrapped in its original plastic, featuring a red fire truck and a smiling firefighter waving from the side. He had bought it the week before while picking up bread and milk at the supermarket. He hadn't planned to buy anything else. But when he passed the toy aisle, he stopped, looked at the shelf his son used to insist on climbing just to reach the perfect building set. Among toys too expensive or too complicated, he picked the smallest one. Simple, few pieces, no long instructions. When he got home, he hadn't planned to give it to anyone. But that morning, when Max had handed him the paper Christmas tree, Walter had noticed the boy's shoes, worn through at the heels, and the tear on one of the jacket sleeves. The way Max folded the tree carefully, even though the edges didn't quite match, reminded Walter of something he couldn't name, but couldn't forget either. And now the Lego box sat on the table. No gift wrap, no shiny paper, no ribbon, just a brown paper grocery bag. He opened it, placed the toy inside, folded the top down gently, twice with his hands flat and neat. No tape, no string. Simple, deliberate. Like every kind act he'd ever done. Never flashy, always quiet. He found a small scrap of white paper, began to write something, but stopped. The pen trembled slightly in his hand. He tore the paper, balled it up, didn't write anything else. His hand smoothed out the top of the bag. He set it on the table and stared at it a little longer, as if waiting for the gift to say something to him first. Then he stood up, pulled on a sweater, opened the door. Outside, the night was deepening. Christmas lights flickered on across neighboring homes, strands of red, green, and gold blinking across porches. Walter stepped down the wooden stairs, the brown paper bag in hand, and walked slowly toward Max's house. There were no Christmas lights at Max's place, just a small potted aster by the door, nearly dead, but still holding a few green leaves. Walter placed the paper bag gently on the doorknob. Didn't knock. He paused there a moment, peered through the window, faint light inside, probably from the kitchen. No voices, no television. Just a simple home doing its best to hold warmth inside. He turned away, unhurried. Back on his own porch, Walter stopped. The wind had begun to carry the first flakes of snow, small and scattered, like someone quietly trying to stitch the sky back together. The first ones melted as soon as they touched the wood, but still, they fell. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had left the gift on Max's door. It no longer trembled. Maybe, just maybe, that simple act, leaving behind a gift with no expectation of thanks, had sewn back together a little piece of him too. On Max's doorknob, the brown paper bag swayed gently in the breeze. No sender's name, no message. But someone had chosen to believe in giving, even without knowing if anything would be given back. Part 11. The Empty Chair and Warm Butter Cookies. On Christmas night, Walter's house carried a silence so full that it didn't need anyone else inside to tell what was missing. No scent of cinnamon, no background music, no blinking lights, just the soft golden glow from a single lamp beside the kitchen, and the wind brushing steadily past the window pane, like footsteps that never stop in the life of a man. Walter set the table as he always had, one porcelain plate, one set of worn stainless steel cutlery, one cream-colored ceramic teacup. No patterns, no decorations, but all clean, placed with care, as if the invited guest might still walk in at any moment. Across from him, he placed an extra chair, empty. It wasn't meant to be filled. It was a habit, left over from Christmases past. There always had to be room for someone you hoped might return. Some chairs aren't meant to be taken. They're meant to preserve someone's outline. Walter placed the butter cookies in the center of the table. He had baked them again that afternoon, the last batch. In the middle sat a small tin tray, lined with white napkin. They were still, faintly warm, soft, fragrant, golden smooth on the surface. No cracks. No one had ever praised that detail before. But tonight, Walter knew it mattered. He sat in his usual chair, looked across at the empty one. He didn't rush to eat, didn't touch his tea, just sat, letting the light gently reveal the weariness behind his glasses, the kind of tiredness that lives in the heart, not the body. Then, like a breath interrupting stillness, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just a soft knock, like someone who had once lived in this house and knew exactly when to come and how to come. Walter didn't rise right away. He sat for a few more seconds, then gently pushed back his chair. He walked to the door with empty hands, as if just opening it might be enough to close something else. Standing on the porch was Mark. No Jenna. No car engine. No suitcases. No gifts. Just his son, in a gray sweater, hair slightly messy and tired eyes, the kind of tired young people often hide behind decisive choices. They looked at each other. No one spoke. Snowflakes settled on Mark's shoulders, light as ash. Walter didn't ask why he came. Didn't ask why he came alone. He simply leaned aside and opened the door wide. Mark stepped in. He didn't take off his coat, didn't move quickly. He just stood at the threshold, glancing toward the table where an empty chair was still waiting. He nodded slightly, not a greeting, but as if confirming something long held inside. Walter walked ahead. Mark followed. The door closed behind them, gently. Two men, one old, one young, sat at the table. No explanations. No apologies. Between them sat the tray of still warm butter cookies. Mark looked at the cookies, and suddenly his expression softened, like a light breeze clearing the dust from a mirror. He reached out for one, placed it on a plate, picked up a knife and cut it in half. The movement wasn't fast, but it wasn't hesitant either. Walter said nothing, just poured more tea. His hands were steady. In the small kitchen, two silhouettes sat in silence, sharing the first pieces of a Christmas that was no longer full, but no longer hopeless either. And between them, on a chair still untouched, there was room for one more, even if that person was no longer here. Part 12. A conversation through eyes. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not in a rush, not heavily, but like fine white threads carefully let down by some distant, gentle hand. On rooftops, the early layers of snow settled so softly they made no sound. They simply were there. In Walter's kitchen, a soft yellow glow cast over the wooden table. Two teacups filled to the brim, a tray of butter cookies, already half gone, and two men sitting across from each other. No extra gestures, no small talk, just a slow atmosphere, like they had both traveled a long road without needing to speak about it. Walter and Mark said nothing for the first 10 minutes, only the clink of spoon against cup, the soft crumble of cookies breaking onto napkins, and the wind, as always, slipping quietly through the window frame, left unrepaired. But no one felt cold. Mark sat slightly hunched, the posture of a grown man trying to make himself smaller, as if not to disturb the quiet balance of a space he once walked away from. His gaze paused more than once on the empty chair at the table, the one that used to belong to his mother. That chair hadn't been moved. No one sat in it, but clearly it was still there, as much a part of the room, of the meal, and of him as anything else. Mark placed half of his cookie down, lifted his head to look at his father. There was no request in his eyes, no plea for permission. Just one sentence, barely louder than a breath. "I miss Mom." Walter looked back, long, but not intensely. His eyes were like an old lake, quietly reflecting an image without color or drama. Inside them, there was no answer, no philosophy, no forced comfort. Just one truth, spoken in a voice that wasn't old, wasn't shaky, but had clearly traveled through a lot of silence. So do I. And then silence again. But unlike before, this silence wasn't hesitant or wary. It felt like a shared blanket, thin, invisible, but warm enough that both of them could feel it. Mark picked up his teacup, took a small sip. His eyes turned red, not from the heat. He looked down, shielding his face, but didn't rush to wipe it. Walter didn't ask anything. He simply slid the cookie tray a little closer to his son. Not insistently, not invitingly, just gently. There were no apologies exchanged, no "I should have," no "if only." And maybe there didn't need to be. Because sometimes an honest sentence, a returned gaze, a moment that requires no explanation is enough to tie back together a thread no one remembers dropping. The empty chair remained unoccupied, but the space around it no longer felt cold. The air around the table no longer felt heavy. And, perhaps, if someone were to walk past Walter's house just then, they might see a kind of light, not coming from a lamp, but from two pairs of eyes, one blurred, one aged, quietly learning how to accept each other again. Part 13. The Tin Box and the Note. The morning of December 26th was calm. After a bitterly cold night, a thin layer of snow-covered porch roofs, garden chairs, and the wooden steps. It wasn't deep, not enough to sink your feet into, but just enough to hush everything. The door opening, the kettle beginning to boil, even the breath of an old man escaping the collar of a worn sweater. Walter woke early. In the kitchen, filled with the soft scent of Earl Grey, he stood by the counter, wearing an apron, carefully placing freshly baked butter cookies into a round tin box. The tin was bluish-gray, rimmed with silver, once used to hold his wife's sewing supplies, now empty, clean, as if patiently waiting to be repurposed for something kind. Walter didn't bake many cookies. Exactly 8, just enough to not have any left over, just enough to give without feeling the loss. He placed the final piece in, then laid a thin paper napkin over them, smoothing it down with his hand. No plastic wrap, no sealing, just enough to keep the warmth from escaping too fast. He tore a small scrap from the edge of an old notebook. Lined paper, yellowed, corner slightly curled. He wrote in blue ink, "Merry Christmas," from a neighbor who's learning to share again. The handwriting wasn't pretty, but it was steady, tidy, like the way he used to write his wife's name on envelopes back when every kind act was wrapped in quiet. He folded the paper, slipped it between the lid and the edge of the tin. Then he put on his coat and stepped outside. The morning air wasn't strong, but it bit at the cheeks. On the ground, snow still held the prints of birds and the faint trail of a bicycle from the day before. He walked slowly to the house next door, Max's house. It looked the same as always, curtains drawn, lights still off, probably still asleep, but on the windowsill the little folded paper tree still stood, now covered with a soft white layer. as if someone had wrapped it in a new winter coat. Walter didn't knock. He simply bent down, placed the tin carefully by the door, slightly off to the side, so no one would step on it when they came out. He brushed the edge of the box lightly, as though straightening something invisible. Then he stood. He didn't look inside, just paused for a moment, listening to the breeze slipping past bare trees along the road, and turned to walk home. No one saw him smile. No one needed to. Because some acts of kindness, when done, don't return as thank yous, but as a small weight, lifting from the heart enough to take the next step forward. And sometimes that begins with a tin of warm cookies, not wrapped fancy, not signed with a name, just a handwritten note from an old man relearning how to give without fear of losing. Part 14, The Bicycle and Balance. That afternoon the sky was astonishingly clear, as if it had been rinsed clean after a light snowfall. The sunlight was a deep, gentle blue, not harsh, soft, like an exhale after someone has finally let go of something heavy. Afternoon rays slanted across rooftops, dusted in snow, casting long streaks of gold on the path between two wooden fences. Walter stood on his front porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, quietly watching. Max, the little boy next door, was fussing with an old bicycle. He wore a red knit hat with a fuzzy pom-pom dangling from the top. The rear tire was worn, the seat scratched, and the bell broken. He didn't hop on right away, just pushed the bike in slow circles around the yard, as if coaxing a sulking friend to come back and play. Walter slowly stepped down from the porch, leaned against the wooden fence. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood there, like a small lamp that switches on at dusk, not bright, but enough for someone to know they aren't practicing alone. Max turned his head, saw him, smiled, didn't speak, then climbed onto the bike. The frame wobbled slightly. The front wheel veered a bit as he started pedaling. Max tried to sit upright, gripping the handlebars tightly. His little legs pushed hard, but every time the bike tilted, he leaned awkwardly, never falling, but never quite steady either. Walter still said nothing. He simply watched the wheel turn, watched each awkward correction, each clumsy stop when the bike strayed from the path. After a while, Max stopped near the fence, breathing heavily. His cheeks were red from the cold, eyes squinting slightly in the wind. He looked at Walter and asked quietly, "When will I stop falling, Grandpa?" Walter tilted his head back, eyes squinting at the sky. The air had grown colder, but in the fading light of day, his voice was soft and steady. "When you learn how to keep your balance, even when no one's holding on." Max was silent. He nodded, didn't fully understand, but understood enough. Then he lifted his foot onto the pedal again, riding one more lap, this time slower, steadier, without needing a steadying hand behind him. Walter sat on the porch steps, resting his arm on his knee, eyes following the boy's silhouette gliding across the yard. Max made one loop, returned, braked beside him, and smiled. "See? I didn't fall." Walter nodded, smiling faintly. Not a wide grin, not praise, but quiet recognition of something small but important. This boy was growing up, and he finally was learning how to be beside someone without holding on, without controlling, without catching, just present. The two of them sat together on the porch steps, saying nothing more. The sky slowly shifted color. A soft breeze brushed across the eaves, carrying with it the faint scent of butter cookies, maybe from Walter's house, or maybe just memory. The snow began to melt, and in the end, not the cookies, not the tea, not the folded paper tree, but this quiet moment between an old man and a small boy was the true Christmas gift, knowing you're not alone, even when no one's holding your hand. Walter stopped the monthly transfers, not out of bitterness, but because he needed to stop. Sometimes a man chooses to disconnect, not to sever ties, but to be seen. No one lives their whole life giving without once wishing to be called by name. This year's Christmas gift wasn't the butter cookies, wasn't the paper tree, wasn't the unexpected reunion. The gift was that someone who had been left behind still chose to stay, not for someone else, but for himself. If you've ever sat across from an empty chair in your life, ever waited for someone to come back, or ended something silently with no one knowing, share a bit of that with me in the comments. You don't need to write much, just write honestly, because sometimes a single line from you can be the warm light someone else needs in the middle of their own long winter.